Ever wondered how to navigate the intricate web of compliance processes while maintaining top-tier security for your notarial records? The solution is closer than you think. Introducing ComplyChainGuard, or CGG, a platform designed specifically for civil law notaries. CCG merges the complex chain of compliance processes with unrivaled protective measures. It enables you to stride confidently through the multifaceted terrain of regulations while ensuring paramount security for your records, deeds, and transactions. CCG boasts a regulatory compliance engine that keeps you updated with real-time insights tailored to civil law regulations. It effortlessly integrates with legal databases and ensures automated compliance checks for all notarial deeds and transactions. But that's not all. CCG also features advanced encryption to safeguard your notarial records. You'll benefit from multi-factor authentication and periodic security assessments, upholding the sanctity of every notarial act. Plus, with continuous transaction monitoring, you'll receive alerts for any discrepancies and comprehensive logs for traceability. And when it comes to reporting and analytics, CCG generates automated compliance reports specific to notarial acts. Dive into our analytics dashboard for transaction patterns and predictive insights. Why choose CCG? It brings efficiency, security, and compliance to your fingertips, allowing you to operate with unmatched confidence and credibility. CCG integrates effortlessly with your notarial record-keeping systems. Our API facilitates bespoke integrations, ensuring compatibility with major legal platforms and databases. And remember, our dedicated support is here to assist you every step of the way. CGG is the future of notarial practices. It redefines your work, ensuring accuracy, credibility, and peace of mind. It's a transformative experience tailored for civil law notaries. Don't wait. Contact ComplyChainGuard for a demo or more information. Step into the future of notarial practices. Your journey to seamless compliance and robust security starts with CCG.
Tower of Basel, the shadowy history of the secret bank that runs the world. Written by Adam Labor, narrated by John Mawson. The bank is completely removed from any governmental or political control. Gates Magara, first president of the Bank for International Settlements, 1931. Introduction. The world's most exclusive club has 18 members. They gather every other month on a Sunday evening at 7 p.m. in Conference Room E in a circular tower block whose tinted windows overlook the central Basel railway station. Their discussion lasts for 1 hour, perhaps an hour and a half. Some of those present bring a colleague with them, but the aides rarely speak during this most confidential of conclaves. The meeting closes, the aides leave, and those remaining retire for dinner in the dining room on the 18th floor, rightly confident that the food and the wine will be superb. The meal, which continues until 11 p.m. or midnight, is where the real work is done. The protocol and hospitality, honed for more than 8 decades, are faultless. Anything said at the dining table, it is understood, is not to be repeated elsewhere. Few, if any, of those enjoying their haute cuisine and Grand Cru wines, some of the best Switzerland can offer, would be recognized by passers-by, but they include a good number of the most powerful people in the world. These men, they are almost all men, are central bankers. They have come to Basel to attend the Economic Consultative Committee, ECC, of the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, which is the bank for central banks. Its current members include Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, Sir Mervyn King, the governor of the Bank of England, Mario Draghi of the European Central Bank, Zhou Zhaoxuan of the Bank of China, and the central bank governors of Germany, France, Italy, Sweden, Canada, India, and Brazil. Jaime Caruana, a former governor of the Bank of Spain, the BIS's general manager, joins them. In early 2013, when this book went to press, King, who is due to step down as Governor of the Bank of England in June 2013, chaired the ECC. The ECC, which used to be known as the G10 Governors Meeting, is the most influential of the BIS's numerous gatherings, open only to a small, select group of central bankers from advanced economies. The ECC makes recommendations on the membership and organization of the 3 BIS committees that deal with the global financial system, payments systems, and international markets. The committee also prepares proposals for the Global Economy meeting and guides its agenda. That meeting starts at 9:30 a.m. on Monday morning in Room B and lasts for 3 hours. There, King presides over the central bank governors of the 30 countries judged the most important to the global economy. In addition to those who are present at the Sunday evening dinner, Monday's meeting will include representatives from, for example, Indonesia, Poland, South Africa, Spain, and Turkey. Governors from 15 smaller countries, such as Hungary, Israel, and New Zealand, are allowed to sit in as observers, but do not usually speak. Governors from the third tier of member banks, such as Macedonia and Slovakia, are not allowed to attend. Instead, they must forage for scraps of information at coffee and meal breaks. The governors of all 60 BIS member banks then enjoy a buffet lunch in the 18th floor dining room. Designed by Herzog and Dumeron, the Swiss architectural firm which built the Bird's Nest Stadium for the Beijing Olympics, the dining room has white walls, a black ceiling, and spectacular views over 3 countries, Switzerland, France, and Germany. At 2 p.m., the central bankers and their aides return to Room B for the governors' meeting to discuss matters of interest until the gathering ends at 5. King takes a very different approach than his predecessor, Jean-Claude Trichet, the former president of the European Central Bank, in chairing the Global Economy meeting. Trichet, according to one former central banker, was notably Gallic in his style, a stickler for protocol who called the central bankers to speak in order of importance, starting with the governors of the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and the Bundesbank, and then progressing down the hierarchy. King, in contrast, adopts a more thematic and egalitarian approach, throwing open the meetings for discussion and inviting contributions from all present. The governors' conclaves have played a crucial role in determining the world's response to the global financial crisis. The BIS has been a very important meeting point for central bankers during the crisis, and the rationale for its existence has expanded, said King. We have had to face challenges that we have never seen before. We had to work out what was going on, what instruments do we use when interest rates are close to zero, how do we communicate policy. We discussed this at home with our staff, but it is very valuable for the governors themselves to get together and talk among themselves. Those discussions, say central bankers, must be confidential. When you are at the top in the number 1 post, it can be pretty lonely at times. It is helpful to be able to meet other number 1s and say, "This is my problem, how do you deal with it?" King continued. Being able to talk informally and openly about our experiences has been immensely valuable. We are not speaking in a public forum. We can say what we really think and believe, and we can ask questions and benefit from others. The BIS management works hard to ensure that the atmosphere is friendly and clubbable throughout the weekend, and it seems they succeed. The bank arranges a fleet of limousines to pick up the governors at Zurich Airport and bring them to Basel. Separate breakfasts, lunches, and dinners are organized for the governors of national banks who oversee different types and sizes of national economies, so no one feels excluded. The central bankers were more at home and relaxed with their fellow central bankers than with their own governments, recalled Paul Volcker, the former chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, who attended the Basel weekends. The superb quality of the food and wine made for an easy camaraderie, said Peter Ákos-Baude, a former governor of the National Bank of Hungary. The main topics of discussion were the quality of the wine and the stupidity of finance ministers. If you had no knowledge of wine, you could not join in the conversation. And the conversation is usually stimulating and enjoyable, say central bankers. The contrast between the Federal Open Markets Committee at the U.S. Federal Reserve and the Sunday evening G10 governors' dinners was notable, recalled Lawrence Meyer, who served as a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve from 1996 until 2002. The chairman of the Federal Reserve did not always represent the bank at the Basel meetings, so Meyer occasionally attended. The BIS discussions were always lively, focused, and thought-provoking. At FMOC meetings, while I was at the Fed, almost all the committee members read statements which had been prepared in advance. They very rarely referred to statements by other committee members, and there was almost never an exchange between two members or an ongoing discussion about the outlook or policy options. At BIS dinners, people actually talk to each other, and the discussions are always stimulating and interactive, focused on the serious issues facing the global economy. All the governors present at the two-day gathering are assured of total confidentiality, discretion, and the highest levels of security. The meetings take place on several floors that are usually used only when the governors are in attendance. The governors are provided with a dedicated office and the necessary support and secretarial staff. The Swiss authorities have no jurisdiction over the BIS premises. Founded by an international treaty and further protected by the 1987 Headquarters Agreement with the Swiss government, the BIS enjoys similar protections to those granted to the headquarters of the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and diplomatic embassies. The Swiss authorities need the permission of the BIS management to enter the bank's buildings, which are described as inviolable. The BIS has the right to communicate in code and to send and receive correspondence in bags covered by the same protection as embassies, meaning they cannot be opened. The BIS is exempt from Swiss taxes. Its employees do not have to pay income tax on their salaries, which are usually generous, designed to compete with the private sector. The general manager's salary in 2011 was 763,930 Swiss francs, while head of departments were paid 587,640 per annum, plus generous allowances. The bank's extraordinary legal privileges also extend to its staff and directors. Senior managers enjoy a special status similar to that of diplomats while carrying out their duties in Switzerland, which means their bags cannot be searched unless there is evidence of a blatant criminal act, and their papers are inviolable. The central bank governors travelling to Basel for the bi-monthly meetings enjoy the same status while in Switzerland. All bank officials are immune under Swiss law for life for all the acts carried out during the discharge of their duties. The bank is a popular place to work, and not just because of the salaries. Around 600 staff come from over 50 countries. The atmosphere is multinational and cosmopolitan, albeit very Swiss, emphasizing the bank's hierarchy. Like many of those working for the UN or the IMF, some of the staff of the BIS, especially senior management, are driven by a sense of mission, that they are working for a higher, even celestial purpose, and so are immune from normal considerations of accountability and transparency. The bank's management has tried to plan for every eventuality, so that the Swiss police need never be called. The BIS headquarters has high-tech sprinkler systems with multiple backups, in-house medical facilities, and its own bomb shelter in the event of a terrorist attack or armed conflagration. The BIS's assets are not subject to civil claims under Swiss law and can never be seized. The BIS strictly guards the banker's secrecy. The minutes, agenda, and actual attendance list of the Global Economy Meeting or the ECC are not released in any form. This is because no official minutes are taken, although the bankers sometimes scribble their own notes. Sometimes there will be a brief press conference or bland statement afterwards, but never anything detailed. This tradition of privileged confidentiality reaches back to the bank's foundation. The quietness of Basel and its absolutely non-political character provide a perfect setting for those equally quiet and non-political gatherings, wrote one American official in 1935. The regularity of the meetings and their almost unbroken attendance by practically every member of the board make them such they rarely attract any but the most meager notice in the press. 40 years on, little had changed. Charles Coombs, a former foreign exchange chief of the New York Federal Reserve, attended governors' meetings from 1960 to 1975. The bankers who were allowed inside the inner sanctum of the governors' meetings trusted each other absolutely, he recalled in his memoirs. However much money was involved, no agreements were ever signed nor memoranda of understanding ever initialized. The word of each official was sufficient, and there were never any disappointments. What, then, does this matter to the rest of us? Bankers have been gathering confidentially since money was first invented. Central bankers like to view themselves as the high priests of finance, as technocrats overseeing arcane monetary rituals and a financial liturgy understood only by a small, self-selecting elite. But the governors who meet in Basel every other month are public servants. Their salaries, airplane tickets, hotel bills, and lucrative pensions when they retire are paid out of the public purse. The national reserves held by central banks are public money, the wealth of nations. The central bankers' discussions at the BIS, the information that they share, the policies that are evaluated, the opinions that are exchanged, and the subsequent decisions that are taken, are profoundly political. Central bankers, whose independence is constitutionally protected, control monetary policy in the developed world. They manage the supply of money to national economies. They set interest rates, thus deciding the value of our savings and investments. They decide whether to focus on austerity or growth. Their decisions shape our lives. The BIS's tradition of secrecy reaches back through the decades. During the 1960s, for example, the bank hosted the London Gold Pool. 8 countries pledged to manipulate the gold market to keep the price at around $35 per ounce, in line with the provisions of the Bretton Woods Accord that governed the post-World War II international financial system. Although the London Gold Pool no longer exists, its successor is the BIS Markets Committee, which meets every other month on the occasion of the governors' meetings to discuss trends in the financial markets. Officials from 21 central banks attend. The committee releases occasional papers, but its agenda and discussions remain secret. Nowadays, the countries represented at the global economy meetings together account for around 4/5 of global gross domestic product, GDP, most of the produced wealth of the world, according to the BIS's own statistics. Central bankers now seem more powerful than politicians, wrote The Economist newspaper, holding the destiny of the global economy in their hands. How did this happen? The BIS, the world's most secretive global financial institution, can claim much of the credit. From its first day of existence, the BIS has dedicated itself to furthering the interests of central banks and building the new architecture of transnational finance. In doing so, it has spawned a new class of close-knit global technocrats whose members glide between highly paid positions at the BIS, the IMF, and central and commercial banks. The founder of the technocrats' cabal was Per Jakobsson, the Swedish economist who served as the BIS's economic advisor from 1931 to 1956. The bland title belied his power and reach. Enormously influential, well-connected, and highly regarded by his peers, Jakobsson wrote the first BIS annual reports, which were, and remain, essential reading throughout the world's treasuries. Jakobsson was an early supporter of European federalism. He argued relentlessly against inflation, excessive government spending, and state intervention in the economy. Jakobsson left the BIS in 1956 to take over the IMF. His legacy still shapes our world. The consequences of his mix of economic liberalism, price obsession, and dismantling of national sovereignty play out nightly in the European news bulletins on our television screens. The BIS's defenders deny that the organization is secretive. The bank's archives are open, and researchers may consult most documents that are more than 30 years old. The BIS archivists are indeed cordial, helpful, and professional. The bank's website includes all its annual reports, which are downloadable, as well as numerous policy papers produced by the bank's highly regarded research department. The BIS publishes detailed accounts of the securities and derivatives markets and international banking statistics. But these are largely compilations and analysis of information already in the public domain. The details of the bank's own core activities, including much of its banking operations for its customers, central banks, and international organizations, remain secret. The global economy meetings and the other crucial financial gatherings that take place at Basel, such as the Markets Committee, remain closed to outsiders. Private individuals may not hold an account at BIS, unless they work for the bank. The bank's opacity, lack of accountability, and ever-increasing influence raises profound questions, not just about monetary policy, but transparency, accountability, and how power is exercised in our democracies. When I explained to friends and acquaintances that I was writing a book about the Bank for International Settlements, the usual response was a puzzled look followed by a question. The bank for what? My interlocutors were intelligent people who follow current affairs. Many had some interest in and understanding of the global economy and financial crisis. Yet only a handful had heard of the BIS. This was strange, as the BIS is the most important bank in the world and predates both the IMF and the World Bank. For decades, it has stood at the center of a global network of money, power, and covert global influence. The BIS was founded in 1930. It was ostensibly set up as part of the Young Plan to administer German reparations payments for the First World War. The bank's key architects were Montague Norman, who was the governor of the Bank of England, and Hjalmar Schacht, the president of the Reichsbank, who described the BIS as my bank. The BIS's founding members were the central banks of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, and a consortium of Japanese banks. Shares were also offered to the Federal Reserve, but the United States, suspicious of anything that might infringe on its national sovereignty, refused its allocation. Instead, a consortium of commercial banks took up the shares. J.P. Morgan, the First National Bank of New York, and the First National Bank of Chicago. The real purpose of the BIS was detailed in its statutes to promote the cooperation of central banks and to provide additional facilities for international financial operations. It was the culmination of the central bankers' decades-old dream to have their own bank, powerful, independent, and free from interfering politicians and nosy reporters. Most felicitous of all, the BIS was self-financing and would be in perpetuity. Its clients were its own founders and shareholders, the central banks. During the 1930s, the BIS was the central meeting place for a cabal of central bankers, dominated by Norman and Schacht. This group helped rebuild Germany. The New York Times described Schacht, widely acknowledged as the genius behind the resurgent German economy, as the iron-willed pilot of Nazi finance. During the war, the BIS became a de facto arm of the Reichsbank, accepting looted Nazi gold and carrying out foreign exchange deals for Nazi Germany. The bank's alliance with Berlin was known in Washington, D.C. and London. But the need for the BIS to keep functioning, to keep the new channels of transnational finance open, was about the only thing all sides agreed on. Basel was the perfect location, as it is perched on the northern edge of Switzerland and sits almost on the French and German borders. A few miles away, Nazi and Allied soldiers were fighting and dying. None of that mattered at the BIS. Board meetings were suspended, but relations between the BIS staff of the belligerent nations remained cordial, professional, and productive. Nationalities were irrelevant. The overriding loyalty was to international finance. The president, Thomas McKittrick, was an American. Roger Aubois, the general manager, was French. Paul Hechler, the assistant general manager, was a member of the Nazi Party and signed his correspondence Heil Hitler. Raphael Pilotti, the Secretary General, was Italian. Per Jakobsen, the bank's influential economic advisor, was Swedish. His and Pilotti's deputies were British. After 1945, 5 BIS directors, including Hjalmar Schacht, were charged with war crimes. Germany lost the war but won the economic peace, in large part thanks to the BIS. The international stage, contacts, banking networks, and legitimacy the BIS provided, first to the Reichsbank and then to its successor banks, has helped ensure the continuity of immensely powerful financial and economic interests from the Nazi era to the present day. For the first 47 years of its existence, from 1930 to 1977, the BIS was based in a former hotel near the Basel Central Railway Station. The bank's entrance was tucked away by a chocolate shop, and only a small notice confirmed that the narrow doorway opened into the BIS. The bank's managers believed that those who needed to know where the BIS was would find it, and the rest of the world certainly did not need to know. The inside of the building changed little over the decades, recalled Charles Coons. The BIS provided the Spartan accommodations of a former Victorian-style hotel whose single and double bedrooms had been transformed into offices simply by removing the beds and installing desks. The bank moved into its current headquarters at 2 Central Bahnplatz in 1977. It did not go far and now overlooks the Basel Central Station. Nowadays, the BIS's main mission, in its own words, is threefold: to serve central banks in their pursuit of monetary and financial stability, to foster international cooperation in these areas, and to act as a bank for central banks. The BIS also hosts much of the practical and technical infrastructure that the global network of central banks and their commercial counterparts need to function smoothly. It has 2 linked trading rooms, at the Basel headquarters and Hong Kong regional office. The BIS buys and sells gold and foreign exchange for its clients. It provides asset management and it arranges short-term credit to central banks when needed. The BIS is a unique institution, an international organization, an extremely profitable bank, and a research institute founded and protected by international treaties. The BIS is accountable to its customers and shareholders, the central banks, but also guides their operations. The main tasks of a central bank, the BIS argues, are to control the flow of credit and the volume of currency in circulation, which will ensure a stable business climate, and to keep exchange rates within manageable bands to ensure the value of a currency and so smooth international trade and capital movements. This is crucial, especially in a globalized economy where markets react in microseconds, and perceptions of economic stability and value are almost as important as reality itself. The BIS also helps to supervise commercial banks, although it has no legal powers over them. The Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, based at the BIS, regulates commercial banks' capital and liquidity requirements. It requires banks to have a minimum capital of 8% of risk-weighted assets when lending, meaning that if a bank has risk-weighted assets of $100 million, it must maintain at least $8 million capital. The committee has no powers of enforcement, but it does have enormous moral authority. This regulation is so powerful that the 8% principle has been set into national laws, said Peter Akosh-Bod. It's like voltage. Voltage has been set at 220. You may decide on 95 volts, but it would not work. In theory, sensible housekeeping and mutual cooperation, overseen by the BIS, will keep the global financial system functioning smoothly. In theory. The reality is that we have moved beyond recession into a deep structural crisis, one fueled by the bank's greed and rapacity, which threatens all of our financial security. Just as in the 1930s, parts of Europe face economic collapse. The Bundesbank and the European Central Bank, 2 of the most powerful members of the BIS, have driven the mania for austerity that has already forced one European country, Greece, to the edge, aided by the venality and corruption of the country's ruling class. Others may soon follow. The old order is creaking, its political and financial institutions corroding from within. From Oslo to Athens, the far right is resurgent, fed in part by soaring poverty and unemployment. Anger and cynicism are corroding citizens' faith in democracy and the rule of law. Once again, the value of property and assets is vaporizing before their owners' eyes. The European currency is threatened with breakdown, while those with money seek safe haven in Swiss francs or gold. The young, the talented, and the mobile are again fleeing their home countries for new lives abroad. The powerful forces of international capital that brought the BIS into being, and which granted the bank its power and influence, are again triumphant. The BIS sits at the apex of an international financial system that is falling apart at the seams. But its officials argue that it does not have the power to act as an international financial regulator. Yet the BIS cannot escape its responsibility for the Eurozone crisis. From the first agreements in the late 1940s on multilateral payments to the establishment of the Europe Central Bank in 1998, the BIS has been at the heart of the European integration project, providing technical expertise and the financial mechanisms for currency harmonization. During the 1950s, it managed the European Payments Union, which internationalized the continent's payment system. The BIS hosted the Governors Committee of European Economic Community Central Bankers, set up in 1964, which coordinated trans-European monetary policy. During the 1970s, the BIS ran the snake, the mechanism by which European currencies were held in exchange rate bands. During the 1980s, the BIS hosted the Delors Committee, whose report in 1988 laid out the path to European monetary union and the adoption of a single currency. The BIS midwifed the European Monetary Institute, EMI, the precursor of the European Central Bank. The EMI's president was Alexandre Lamfalussy, one of the world's most influential economists, known as the father of the euro. Before joining the EMI in 1994, Lamfalussy had worked at the BIS for 17 years, first as economic advisor, then as the bank's general manager. For a staid, secretive organization, the BIS has proved surprisingly nimble. It survived the first global depression, the end of reparations payments, and the gold standard, two of its main reasons for existence: the rise of Nazism, the Second World War, the Bretton Woods Accord, the Cold War, the financial crises of the 1980s and 1990s, the birth of the IMF and World Bank, and the end of communism. As Malcolm Knight, manager from 2003 to 2008, noted, "It is encouraging to see that, by remaining small, flexible, and free from political interference, the bank has, throughout its history, succeeded remarkably well in adapting itself to evolving circumstances." The bank has made itself a central pillar of the global financial system. As well as the global economy meetings, the BIS hosts 4 of the most important international committees dealing with global banking: the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, the Committee on the Global Financial System, the Committee on Payment and Settlement Systems, and the Irving-Fisher Committee, which deals with central banking statistics. The bank also hosts 3 independent organizations, 2 groups dealing with insurance, and the Financial Stability Board, FSB. The FSB, which coordinates national financial authorities and regulatory policies, is already being spoken of as the 4th pillar of the global financial system, after the BIS, the IMF, and the commercial banks. The BIS is now the world's 30th largest holder of gold reserves, with 119 metric tons, more than Qatar, Brazil, or Canada. Membership of the BIS remains a privilege rather than a right. The board of directors is responsible for admitting central banks judged to make a substantial contribution to international monetary cooperation and to the bank's activities. China, India, Russia, and Saudi Arabia joined only in 1996. The bank has opened offices in Mexico City and Hong Kong, but remains very Eurocentric. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Macedonia, Slovenia, and Slovakia, total population 16.2 million, have been admitted, while Pakistan, population 169 million, has not. Nor has Kazakhstan, which is a powerhouse of Central Asia. In Africa, only Algeria and South Africa are members. Nigeria, which has the continent's 2nd largest economy, has not been admitted. The BIS's defenders say that it demands high governance standards from new members, and when the national banks of countries such as Nigeria and Pakistan reach those standards, they will be considered for membership. Considering the BIS's pivotal role in the transnational economy, its low profile is remarkable. Back in 1930, a New York Times reporter noted that the culture of secrecy at the BIS was so strong that he was not permitted to look inside the boardroom even after the directors had left. Little has changed. Journalists are not allowed inside the headquarters while the global economy meeting is underway. BIS officials speak rarely on the record and reluctantly to members of the press. The strategy seems to work. The Occupy Wall Street movement, the anti-globalizers, the social network protesters have ignored the BIS. Central Bahnplatz 2, Basel, is quiet and tranquil. There are no demonstrators gathered outside the BIS's headquarters, no protesters camped out in the nearby park, no lively reception committees for the world's central bankers. As the world's economy lurches from crisis to crisis, financial institutions are scrutinized as never before. Legions of reporters, bloggers, and investigative journalists scour the bank's every move. Yet somehow, apart from brief mentions on the financial pages, the BIS has largely managed to avoid critical scrutiny. Until now. Part 1. Kapital über alles. Chapter 1. The Bankers Know Best. I rather hope that next summer we may be able to inaugurate a private and eclectic central banks club, small at first, large in the future. Montague Norman, Governor of the Bank of England, to Benjamin Strong, Governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, in 1925. One day, in the summer of 1929, Montague Norman, the Governor of the Bank of England, picked up the telephone and spoke to Walter Layton, the editor of The Economist. Norman excitedly asked Layton to come to his office as soon as possible to discuss a very important matter. During Norman's term as governor, from 1920 to 1944, he was one of the most influential men in the world, an apparently permanent bastion of the global financial system. His gnomic utterances were scoured for meaning. When he was reappointed governor in 1932, the New York Times described him as overseeing Britain's invisible empire of wealth. Gold standards may come and go, the article noted, but Montague Norman remains. Such was Norman's power that a single speech could move markets. When, in October 1932, Norman gloomily proclaimed at a banker's dinner in London that the world's economic disorder was beyond the control of any man, government, or country, stocks, bonds, and the dollar all slid sharply and quickly in New York. Layton was not surprised by Norman's agitated manner. The governor was a scion of an old and respected banking dynasty, but his mental state was an open secret among financial insiders. Norman was a mercurial figure, a manic depressive, and a workaholic, notorious among financial insiders for his mood swings. Shy and hypersensitive, Norman was introverted to the point of neurosis. Before the First World War, Norman had consulted Carl Jung, the Swiss founder of analytical psychology, to discuss a course of treatment, with no success. Jung had implied that Norman was untreatable, which did not help matters. The world's most powerful banker abhorred publicity, being recognized or socializing, and was prone to fainting fits. He once threw an inkpot at the head of an underling who failed to meet his exacting standards. He was a very unlikely banker. He was more like a 17th-century nobleman or painter, recalled his stepson, Peregrine Worsthorne. He was always very neurotic and had very bad nervous breakdowns. He was very shy and a loner. He had no care for conventions. He came down to dinner without socks and travelled to work on the Underground, which was very unusual in those days. Nor did Norman look the part of a sober financier, with his cape, neatly trimmed Van Dyke beard, and sparkling, jewelled tie-pin. But despite his own flamboyant dress sense, he disapproved of showy behaviour, said Worsthorne. He lived very austerely and discouraged all signs of ostentation. He hated cocktail parties. Norman's horror of publicity naturally had precisely the opposite effect. Although when he sailed across the Atlantic he used an assumed name because the press covered his every move, hordes of journalists and photographers still awaited when he disembarked in New York. The balmy months in 1929 were the last hurrah of the Roaring Twenties. The American bull market was still growing, share prices kept rising. The value of stock in Radio Corporation of America, RCA, rose by almost 50% in a single month. Even Wall Street's shoeshine boys were passing on tips to their broker customers. In August, a brokerage firm announced a new service for those heading to Europe on ocean liners. On-board trading during the week-long crossing. Layton, responding to Norman's summons, quickly made his way to the bank's headquarters at Threadneedle Street, the epicenter of the city, as London's financial quarter is known. Surrounded by a high wall, covering most of a city block, the bank's headquarters were meant to impress, even to intimidate. Behind the giant bronze door lay a complex of courtyards, banking halls, and a garden with a fountain, a veritable Alhambra of money, crowded with clerks and underlings who were bustling along its corridors. Even the terminology was regal. The bank was ruled over not by a board, but by a court. Layton was ushered into Norman's office, where he sat at a mahogany table in the centre of the wood-panelled room. Norman wanted to talk about a new bank, to be called the Bank for International Settlements. The BIS was being set up in connection with the Young Plan, the latest and hopefully final program for implementing German reparations payments for the First World War. But Norman had much more ambitious ideas. The BIS would be the world's first international financial institution. It would be a meeting place for central bankers. Away from the demands of politicians and the prying eyes of nosy journalists, the bankers would bring some much-needed order and coordination to the world financial system. But for the BIS to succeed and properly fulfill its potential, Norman explained, he needed Leighton's help. A subcommittee would soon meet in Baden-Baden in Germany to draw up the bank's statutes. The editor of The Economist, Norman said, was just the man to draft the BIS's constitution, one that must, above all, guarantee the bank's independence from politicians. To understand how and why the BIS wields such influence today, it is necessary to step back to the early 1920s and the arguments about German reparations payments for the First World War. German war guilt was enshrined in the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, but no amount of money could bring back the dead, whose numbers were almost incomprehensible. In July 1916, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, Britain lost 60,000 men, the equivalent of a medium-sized town, mown down in a few hours. France lost a total of 1.4 million soldiers during the 4 years of fighting, and Germany lost 2 million. The United States, which did not enter the conflict until 1917, lost 117,000 men. Reaching agreement on German reparations was a slow, complicated, and politically fraught task. The First World War had internationalized conflict to an unprecedented degree. Its financial fallout was similarly globalized. The war had exacted a terrible cost on Europe's economies, as well as its populations. The fledgling international financial system was ill-designed to deal with the complex demands that were now being placed on it. Where would Germany find the money to pay? What would be the mechanisms by which it would do so? Who would oversee and regulate the reparations payments? These arcane discussions shaped the role, structure, and privileged legal status of the BIS. In 1919, just as there would be in 1945, there were, broadly, two schools of thought, the punishers and the rebuilders. France led the punishers. Les Boches, said the French, must and will pay for their crimes, many of which were carried out on French soil. Norman and the rebuilders, who included most of Wall Street, believed otherwise. Europe could be reconstructed, but its future lay in trade and financial cooperation. The aim was not to reduce Germany to penury, but to help it fix its economy and start trading again as soon as possible. In April 1921, the Reparations Commission announced that Germany would pay a total of 132 billion gold marks, $31.5 billion, payable at 2 billion marks a year. The Commission might as well have demanded 10 times as much. Germany was still reeling from its defeat, society was collapsing, unemployment soared, and there were severe shortages of food. Right-wing extremists, the Freikorps, battled Marxist militants in the streets. Workers' councils took control of Hamburg, Bremen, Leipzig, and central Berlin. This was not the salon Marxism of Greenwich Village or San Francisco, but the real thing, raw and bloody. Hostages were taken, factories were seized, and prisoners were lined up against walls and shot. Karl Marx's predictions about the inevitable destruction of capitalism seemed to be becoming truer by the hour, especially in his homeland. The bankers' fears that Germany was about to follow Russia into communism seemed entirely justified. Hyperinflation set in as the government printed money to keep the economy functioning. Shoppers used wheelbarrows to move the bundles of notes needed to buy basic staples. The chaos had to be stopped. On November 13th, 1923, 5 days after Adolf Hitler's failed beer hall putsch in Munich, a tall, imperious German started work as Reich Currency Commissioner. Hjalmar Schacht demanded and got near dictatorial powers. Working out of a former janitor's closet, he set to work on stabilizing the value of Germany's new currency, the Rentenmark. Currencies were usually backed by gold, but the Rentenmark was backed by the value of Germany's land and holdings, since there was no gold available to back the new currency. This was a somewhat hazy idea. How could the bearer of a Rentenmark redeem his money? Would he be given a small piece of a field? This concern did not matter. As long as Schacht was in office, nobody would want to redeem a Rentenmark. He brilliantly understood the key point of the psychology of money, which is as valid today as it was in the hyperinflation of the 1920s. The appearance of financial stability creates monetary value. If people believed that someone was in charge, that the chaos would end, and that the Rentenmark had value, then it would be valued. The first notes were printed on November 15, 1923. One Rentenmark could be exchanged for 1 trillion old marks. 1,000. One US dollar cost 4.2 Rentenmarks, a return to the pre-World War I exchange rate. The aim, Schacht said, was to make German money scarce and valuable. Other than the logistics of printing and distributing the banknotes, and convincing Schacht's foreign colleagues that order had been returned to the German economy, there was not that much more to it. When German reporters asked Clara Steffek, Schacht's secretary, what he did all day, she replied, "What did he do? He sat in his dark room, which smelled of old cleaning rags, and he smoked. Did he read letters? No. And he dictated no letters. But he found a lot all over the world about domestic and foreign currency. Then he smoked some more. We didn't eat much. He usually left late and took public transportation to go home. That was all." Not quite all. Taxes were raised, and 400,000 German public employees were sacked. But the Rentenmark successfully stopped the German inflation so well that on December 22, 1923, Schacht was promoted to be president of the Reichsbank, while retaining his position as currency commissioner. He could now attend cabinet meetings. Within a few weeks, notes John Weitz, Schacht's biographer, he had virtually become Germany's economic dictator. Schacht certainly looked the part of a strict Prussian banker. His hair was parted precisely down the middle, and his moustache flared briefly under his nose, before stopping at a determined mouth. His eyes stared out suspiciously through a pair of pince-nez. He walked with a rigid, almost military manner, and wore shirts with high celluloid collars. In fact, he was not Prussian at all, but was born in North Schleswig, in a land perennially shunted back and forth between Germany and Denmark. Whoever ruled the province, its inhabitants were a stubborn, hardy people. They adapted easily to their alternating masters, but retained their tenacity and independence, qualities that would serve Schacht well. His grandfather, Wilhelm, was a country doctor who raised 12 children and charged every patient, rich or poor, 60 pfennig. Schacht's father, also called Wilhelm, was a schoolteacher who immigrated to the United States. He worked in a German brewery in Brooklyn and became a naturalized citizen. Hjalmar's mother was a feisty noblewoman, Baroness Constance von Eggers. The Schachts settled in New York City, but they did not prosper, and Wilhelm brought his family back to Europe. In 1876 they moved to Tinlev, now in Denmark, and the following year their second son was born. At first, they wanted to name him in honor of Horace Greeley, an influential New York journalist and politician who campaigned against the slave trade. The Baroness was proud of her radical views. Her father had worked to abolish serfdom in Denmark. The infant's grandmother argued that the boy should at least have a proper Danish name first, so the family compromised on Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht. The family was constantly on the move. They lived for a while in Hamburg and then relocated to Berlin. Hjalmar proved to be a diligent student. He enrolled at Kiel University and studied political economy. He worked as a journalist, tried public relations, and then joined the Dresdner Bank. His diligence, attention to detail, and austere manner helped ensure he was soon noticed. Schacht traveled to the United States with other bank officials. They met President Franklin Roosevelt and were invited to lunch in the partners' dining room at J.P. Morgan. Schacht's understanding of the world outside Germany and his fluent English proved invaluable. He was promoted to be deputy director of Dresdner Bank and joined the board of the Reichsbank. So, in 1923, with the Rentenmark established, the next step was to build a gold reserve to give the new currency real backing. This is why, on the evening of December 31, the Reichsbank president stepped off the train at Liverpool Street Station in central London. To Schacht's surprise and delight, he was met on the platform by Montague Norman himself. "I do hope we shall become friends," said Norman with a shy smile. Schacht told Norman that he wanted the Bank of England to lend $25 million to a new subsidiary of the Reichsbank, the gold discount bank. The new bank would instantly alter global perceptions of the country's financial prospects. The imprimatur of the governor of the Bank of England would open doors throughout Wall Street and the City of London. Tenacious as ever, Schacht got his money. Schacht had sweet-talked Norman, but the reparations question remained unresolved. America was tired of squabbling Europeans who could not get their houses in order, and also recognized that there could be no lasting prosperity while Europe lurched from one financial crisis to another. A new reparations committee was set up under the chairmanship of Charles Dawes, an irascible American banker. The Dawes Committee met in Paris in January 1924. Owen D. Young, the president and chairman of the General Electric Company and the RCA, accompanied Dawes. Young was a consummate diplomat, and needed to be. His job was to persuade France to ease the terms of the reparations schedule, which was destroying the German economy, and thus preventing a European recovery, and then to persuade Germany to accept much more stringent external control of its finances. The Dawes Committee issued its recommendations on April 9. Germany's payments would be reduced for a while and would increase later, after the economy had stabilized. The stabilization would be based in part on a loan of 800 million gold marks, to be floated on the international market. The German government would hold the funds in marks, which would then be paid into an escrow account at the Reichsbank. This account would be controlled by a foreign official known as the Agent General, who could decide how the monies would be used and when they would be released, so as not to flood the markets and affect the value of the Reichsmark. The Reichsbank was placed under the control of a 14-man board of 7 foreigners and 7 Germans. American companies rushed to invest in Germany. The Great War had triggered an economic boom in the United States. Unlike Europe, mainland America had been spared war damage. Its factories and farms and its mines and industrial plants were all untouched and operating at full capacity. The Dawes Plan loan was floated in New York and London in October, and was quickly oversubscribed. American banks soon clamored to finance the companies now investing in the German economy. Between 1924 and 1928, Germany borrowed $600 million a year, half of which was provided by American banks. Much of it swiftly returned from whence it had come. Like modern bailouts, the money swirled back and forth, raising and lowering balance sheets, boosting confidence, and keeping the markets happy. As John Maynard Keynes wrote, "The United States lends money to Germany, Germany transfers its equivalent to the Allies pay it back to the United States government. Nothing real passes. No one is a penny the worse. The engraver's dies, the printer's forms are busier, but no one eats less, no one works more." Some, like Schacht, believed that no one was a penny the better, and he was right. The vast sums were merely a financial adhesive strip, and in October 1929, when Wall Street crashed, American investors frantically pulled out of their German investments in droves. Once again, Germany faced economic disaster. But if Weimar Germany defaulted, the global economy might crash. It was clear that the reparations issue had to be settled. Even Seymour Parker Gilbert, the Agent General in charge of implementing the Dawes Plan, argued that the country needed to take control of its financial destiny. Gilbert was not popular. In 1928, German nationalists staged his mock coronation. 10,000 people watched his effigy crowned, "The new German Kaiser who rules with a top hat for a crown and a coupon clipper for scepter." The answer to the never-ending German reparations question was, of course, another conference. This one was named after its chairman, Owen Young. The delegations arrived in Paris in February 1929, in the coldest winter for nearly a century. The gap between France and Germany over Germany's reparations bill was as cavernous as ever. Schacht made his opening offer, $250 million a year for the next 37 years. Émile Moreau, the equally stubborn governor of the Bank of France, demanded 600 million a year for 62 years. Perhaps even that might not be enough, he informed Young. France might yet settle for nothing less than $1 billion. Moreau refused to budge, and so did Schacht. Any initial optimism soon soured. The Germans were unnerved by the French secret police, who were tapping the German telephones. Schacht and his colleagues communicated with Berlin in coded telegrams. He travelled back every fortnight to consult with the government. Lord Revelstoke, the second in command of the British delegation, wrote in his diary that Schacht had resumed his most negative attitude, was unhelpful to the last degree. With his hatchet-Teuton face and burly neck and badly fitting collar, he resembled a sea lion at the zoo. Whatever sum was finally agreed upon, there was at least some consensus that a new bank would be needed to manage Germany's reparations. Schacht and Norman argued that the new bank would keep the issue free of politics and manage it on a purely financial basis. This was unlikely, as there were no more politically charged issues than reparations, but it showed how the two governors both saw the benefit of a bank free of political constraints. Years later, Schacht titled his autobiography, The Old Wizard. He certainly cast his spell over Owen Young. Germany was paying its reparations by borrowing from other countries, Schacht explained to the conference chairman. Such a system was no longer feasible. If the Allies really wanted Germany to be able to pay its obligations, the country needed to become productive again. Instead of lending to Germany, the Allies should lend to underdeveloped countries so they could buy their industrial equipment from Germany. Young asked how such a plan could be put into practice. Schacht had a ready answer. By setting up a bank. A bank of this kind, argued Schacht, will demand financial cooperation between vanquished and victors that will lead to community of interests, which in turn will give rise to mutual confidence and understanding and thus promote and ensure peace. Schacht recalled the setting in his memoirs. Owen Young, seated in his armchair, puffing away at his pipe, his legs outstretched, his great keen eyes fixed unswervingly on me. As is my habit when propounding such arguments, I was doing a quiet and steady quarterdeck up and down the room. When I had finished, there was a brief pause. Then his whole face lighted up, and his resolve found utterance in words. Dr. Schacht, you gave me a wonderful idea, and I am going to sell it to the world. The Allies then presented their proposal. Germany would pay $525 million a year for 37 years, and $400 million a year for the following 21 years. Schacht would have none of it. He proclaimed that to meet these terms, Germany must take possession again of all its former colonies, most of which were in Africa. He also demanded the return of the Danzig corridor, which linked Poland to the Baltic Sea, which would tear up the post-war peace treaty. When Moreau heard this, he slammed the table with his fist and hurled his ink blotter across the room. A cartoon in a French newspaper summed up the local mood. It showed Moreau asking Schacht, "All right, Excellency, how much do we owe you?" On April 19, 1929, Lord Revelstoke suddenly died. The Young Conference was adjourned. All sides finally reached agreement on June 7. Germany would pay almost $29 billion over 58 years. Control of German economic policy was returned to Berlin. A new bank would administer the payments. Schacht wrote of its birth. In the meantime, my idea of a bank for international settlements had met with such enthusiastic response from all those taking part in the Young Conference that soon there was not one among them who would not have liked to claim the suggestion as his own. As the delegates signed the final version, the curtains in the meeting hall caught fire. The Young plan was accepted in principle at the first Hague Conference, and 7 committees were set up to work out the technical details. At Schacht's suggestion, the 7th, the Organization Committee, gathered in Baden-Baden. This was the most important committee, and it was responsible for drafting the statutes of the new bank and its relations with the host country, which would regulate its legal status. The delegates argued about governance, the role of the directors and managers, and even the official language of the new bank statutes. It was eventually agreed that both the French and English texts would be authentic. The bank would hold central bank's gold and convertible currency deposits. These deposits could be used to settle international payments without having to either physically move the gold between banks or trade the currency through foreign exchange markets. The BIS would be an international clearinghouse for central banks, the world's first. And with the broad outline settled, the next question was where the new bank should be located. Montagu Norman and the British government pushed for London. France objected, on principle, and argued that the new bank should be located in a small country. There was some talk of Amsterdam, and finally the delegates settled on Basel, Switzerland, which was conveniently located on several international railway lines and on the borders of France and Germany. Meanwhile, in London, Walter Layton, the editor of The Economist, was still grappling with the new bank's constitution. The key point, as Layton recalled, was to work out some form of words that would place the bank beyond the reach of governments. Layton struggled hopelessly, and then told Norman that he had failed. "Why do you insist it can't be done?" Norman demanded, annoyed. "Because it's the right of every democratic government to reserve its freedom of action," Layton replied, an argument that would resonate through the decades. Layton admitted defeat. The Constitution was eventually drafted by one of the many committees set up to establish the BIS. But Norman was victorious. The bank's statutes, still extant today, enshrined its absolute independence from interfering politicians and governments. As for Schacht, chastened and unhappy about the reparations demands of the Young Plan, he travelled to the Spa of Marienbad in Czechoslovakia to spend time with his wife, Louise. Narrow-minded, rigid, and intensely Prussian, as he later described her, Louise met him at the train station. She shouted, "You should never have signed!" But Schacht and Montagu Norman had their bank. Chapter 2. A Cosy Club in Basel. The hangover of secrecy was indeed so strong that the attendants would not permit a look into that sacred room even after all the directors had left. Clarence K. Strait, on the BIS boardroom after the directors' meeting, writing in the New York Times Magazine, July 1930. In September 1930, a few months after the BIS opened for business, an American lawyer named Allen Dulles sat down in his office at 37 Rue Cambon in Paris to write a letter to Leon Fraser. Fraser, a fellow American, was also a lawyer. A former reporter for the New York World newspaper, Fraser had served as general counsel for the execution of the Dawes Plan and had taken part in the negotiations at Baden-Baden on the structure of the BIS. Fraser was now a board member of the BIS and the bank's alternating president. Dulles was confident that his request, which was simple enough, would be granted. After all, he was a scion of one of the most powerful families in the United States. His uncle, Robert Lansing, had served as Secretary of State, as had his grandfather, John W. Foster. Born in 1893 in Watertown, New York, Dulles had graduated from Princeton University and joined the U.S. Foreign Service. He was posted to Vienna, Austria, until the United States entered the war in 1917, when he moved to Bern, Switzerland, to work as a junior intelligence officer at the U.S. legation. Neutral Switzerland, home to squabbling émigrés, businessmen and revolutionaries, provided a bountiful harvest of information. "It is almost impossible to stop for any length of time in Switzerland," Dulles wrote, "without coming into contact with questionable characters. Bern is just full of agents and representatives of all nationalities." Dulles relished the world of shadows. Even as a precocious schoolboy, he had shown an insatiable appetite for intrigue and geopolitics. He wrote his first book at the age of 7. The Boer War was a short treatise on how the Boers, the Dutch settlers, had first claim on southern Africa, as they had arrived there before their British overlords. Montagu Norman, who fought in the Second Boer War at the start of the 20th century, might have disagreed. 700 copies were privately printed and sold at 50 cents each, with the proceeds being donated to a Boer charity. But the future director of the CIA did not always know how to assess a potential source. He later loved to recount the story of how one day in April 1917 the telephone rang at the U.S. legation in Bern. Dulles took the call. A Russian émigré leader urgently wanted to meet with an American diplomat. Dulles refused, as he wanted to play tennis instead. The next day, the man who had telephoned left Switzerland on a sealed train for the Finland station, a railway station in St. Petersburg, Russia. The city would later be renamed Leningrad in his honor. From Bern, Dulles was dispatched to Paris as part of the US team at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. Officially, he was included as a member of the commission drawing up the boundary of the new state of Czechoslovakia. In fact, Dulles was running the American diplomatic intelligence operation for Central Europe and courting and monitoring its émigrés, exiles, and revolutionaries. By 1930, when Dulles wrote to Leon Fraser, Dulles had left the Foreign Service. He and his brother, John Foster Dulles, became partners at Sullivan & Cromwell, the most powerful law firm in the United States, if not the world, headquartered at 48 Wall Street in New York. Alan Dulles ran Sullivan & Cromwell's office in Paris and knew Hjalmar Schacht well. In Paris in 1919, Dulles had learnt about diplomacy, and in Paris in 1930, he would learn about the world of high finance and the BIS. Dulles, wrote biographer Peter Grosz, was plunged into a realm where sovereign frontiers were transparent and the trappings of democracies seldom allowed to penetrate. Like beguiled readers of Eric Ambler or Graham Greene, Alan discovered that only a thin line divided respectable high finance from a shadowy underworld. While Montague Norman and Hjalmar Schacht had exploited the chaos around the German reparations question to finesse the world's leading powers into creating the BIS, the Dulles brothers used Europe's disorder to broker deals and monetary instruments to refinance Germany that were so complex that few outside their offices at Sullivan & Cromwell could understand them. Much of this web was connected to the BIS via the Dulles brothers and their friends on Wall Street and in London and Germany. New York banks had led the way during the 1920s in raising money for Germany, and the City of London had also provided significant funds. Foremost among the British banks was J. Henry Schroeder, the London operation of the well-established German banking firm of the same name that was based in Hamburg. Schroeder, in London, set up a trust to invest in numerous German firms, including IG Farben, Siemens, and Deutsche Bank. Frank Tiaux, who was a partner in the London branch of Schroeder, set up a subsidiary in New York called SecureBankBox. It opened for business in October 1923 and was an instant success. The president of SecureBankBox was an American banker named Prentice Gray, who was a close friend of John Foster Dulles's, whom Gray had met at the Paris Peace Conference. Schroeder's historic German connections and contacts made that country a natural focus of SecureBankBox. The company quickly became one of the leading agents for doing business in Germany and later for processing loans under the Dawes and Young reparations plans. Among SecureBankBox's shareholders were a number of German, Swiss, and Austrian private banks, which included, naturally, the Hamburg branch of J. Henry Schroeder, as well as a bank called J. H. Stein of Cologne. One of J. H. Stein's partners, who was a scion of the Schroeder dynasty, would later join the board of the BIS and use J. H. Stein to funnel money from German industrialists to Heinrich Himmler's personal slush fund. Frank Tiaux was a director of the Bank of England and a close colleague of Montague Norman. Tiaux had his eye on an American financier named Gates Magara, whom Tiaux wanted to recruit to the board of SecureBankBox. Magara, whom Tiaux described as one of the most important American bankers, was a director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He also had excellent connections in Germany. He had represented the United States at the Reichsbank when it was held under international control. Magara stayed on the SecureBankBox board until 1927, when he returned to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York as chairman. He stayed there until 1930, when he was appointed the first president of the BIS. As for SecureBankBox, its complicated German investments were in good hands. The bank's lawyer was Alan Dulles. The links were so close that in 1929 SecureBankBox moved into spacious new offices at 48 Wall Street, the same building that housed Sullivan & Cromwell. Alan Dulles had a simple request for Leon Fraser that autumn of 1930. His sister, Eleanor Lansing Dulles, had received a scholarship from Harvard University to write a book about the BIS. Eleanor Dulles was a well-regarded academic and currency expert, who had previously written a book about the French franc. Allen Dulles wrote, "Anything you can do for her would be greatly appreciated, and I can assure you she is a very discreet person." Like her brothers, Eleanor Dulles also had easy access to the world's most powerful bankers and financiers. Allen Dulles's letter was not the first Fraser had received that asked him to assist Eleanor. Owen Young had written in May of that year, and Gates McGarrah, the BIS president, was also getting letters about Eleanor Dulles. Paul Warburg, the eminent banker, had written to McGarrah from the headquarters of M.M. Warburg at 40 Wall Street in New York. Warburg explained that Eleanor was a sister of my good friend John Foster Dulles, whose name is well known to you as a writer on international questions, and whom you undoubtedly know personally. Jackson Reynolds, president of the First National Bank of New York, who had chaired the BIS Organization Committee in Baden-Baden, wrote to McGarrah from 2 Wall Street. He asked McGarrah to assist Miss Dulles, especially as she was the sister of Reynolds' friend, John Foster Dulles. There were few, if any, people in the United States then with a more powerful and influential set of friends than John Foster Dulles, who served as legal counsel to the U.S. delegation at the Paris Peace Conference, where he had specialized in German war reparations. His time in Paris gave him a privileged insight into the workings of international finance and diplomacy and a network of coveted contacts. Dulles's client list during the 1920s read like a who's who of American finance. J.P. Morgan, Kuhn, Loeb & Co., Harris, Forbes & Co., Brown Brothers, W.A. Harriman, and Goldman Sachs. Dulles arranged tens of millions of dollars worth of loans to clients, including to the cities of Munich, Frankfurt, Nuremberg, Berlin, and Hanover, and to the Union of German Mortgage Banks, the Berlin City Electric Company, Hamburg Street Railways, and the State of Prussia. Dulles also worked on the Dawes Plan German loan in 1924 and the German Government International loan of 1930 that had been instigated by the Young Committee. Wall Street in the 1920s was possessed by a near mania to lend to Germany. In 1923, American banks and finance houses sent abroad $458 million in long-term capital. By 1928, that sum had risen to $1.6 billion. The German credit bubble reached ludicrous extremes. A small village in Bavaria, which needed around $125,000, was persuaded to borrow $3 million. But the real significance of this flow of capital was not just financial. The bonds between the American bankers, businessmen, and industrialists and their German counterparts would prove far more durable than the doomed Weimar Republic, and even the Third Reich. With the BIS as the central point of contact, these links would endure during the Second World War and reshape Europe after 1945. Allen Dulles returned to Bern during the Second World War as a far more experienced, powerful, and influential spy master, harvesting much information through his assets at the BIS. John Foster Dulles went on to become U.S. Secretary of State for the Eisenhower administration during the 1950s, at the height of the Cold War. The Dulles brothers would help ensure that Nazi bankers, businessmen, and industrialists, many of whom should have been tried for war crimes, was seamlessly integrated back into powerful positions in the new Federal Republic of Germany. For Hjalmar Schacht and Montague Norman, January 20, 1930, was a date to savor. They had created a bank beyond the reach of either national or international law. On that date, the governments of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, Japan, and Switzerland signed an extraordinary document. The Hague Convention guaranteed that the BIS would be the world's most privileged and legally protected bank. Its statutes, which remain in force to this day, essentially make the BIS untouchable. Article 10 of the BIS Constituent Charter noted, "The bank, its property and assets, and all deposits and other funds entrusted to it shall be immune in time of peace and in time of war from any measure such as expropriation, requisition, seizure, confiscation, prohibition or restriction of gold or currency export or import, and any other similar measures." The BIS enjoys the legal privileges of an international organization, but, arguably, it is not one as usually understood by the term. It is a highly profitable bank that is accountable to and controlled by its members, central banks. Under the cover of the Young Plan, as well as the need for an impartial financial institution to administer German reparation payments, Norman, Schacht, and the central bankers had, by brilliant sleight of hand, created a bank with unprecedented powers and privileges. As Gianni Toniolo, the official historian of the BIS, notes, it was no accident that had been the immediate cause for setting up the BIS, the bank's statutes defined its actual purpose much more broadly: to promote the cooperation of central banks and to provide additional facilities for international finance operations, and to act as trustee or agent in regard to international financial settlements entrusted to it under agreements with the parties concerned. In February 1930, the governors of the central banks of Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Belgium gathered with representatives from Japan and 3 American banks to sign the BIS's instrument of foundation. As the Federal Reserve Bank of New York was not permitted to own shares for political reasons, a consortium was formed: J.P. Morgan, the First National Bank of New York, and the First National Bank of Chicago, to represent the United States. The BIS formally came into existence on February 27, 1930. The bank's initial share capital was set at 500 million Swiss francs, which was divided into 200,000 shares of 2,500 gold francs. The governors of the founding central banks were ex officio members of the board of directors. Each could appoint a second director of the same nationality. The second director did not have to be a central banker. He could be drawn from finance, industry, or commerce, a provision that would later prove crucial in ensuring Nazi influence over the BIS. The BIS was incorporated under Swiss law. Its authorized activities included the following: buying, selling, and holding gold for its own account or for central banks; buying and selling securities other than shares; accepting deposits from central banks; opening and maintaining deposit accounts with central banks; acting as an agent of or correspondent for central banks; entering agreements to act as a trustee or agent in connection with international settlements. There were some restrictions that were intended to prevent the BIS from becoming a competitor of commercial banks. A bank could not issue banknotes, open accounts for individuals or commercial organizations, own property other than its headquarters or offices, or have a controlling interest in a business. The immunities granted under international treaty for reparations settlements did not apply to all of its banking operations to ensure that it maintained the confidence of the international markets. Even better, although the BIS was protected by international treaty, unlike the League of Nations, it was not dependent on budgetary contributions from its members. It enjoyed a guaranteed revenue stream from the reparations payments that it would manage under the Young Plan, as well as from the highly profitable services it would carry out for its clients, the central banks. In the final analysis, notes Toniolo, the BIS, although founded by an international treaty sanctioned by national governments, was very much tailored to the views and requirements of the national banks. The key provisions of the bank's statutes were given protected status, and so could only be changed with the consent of all signatories to the Hague Convention. The BIS was quickly inundated with job applications, even though it was located in humdrum Basel. Its comparatively modest headquarters at the Grand Hotel et Savoy Hotel Univers, next door to Basel main railway station, at least offered convenient direct connections to Paris, Vienna, Milan, and Geneva. An article in the New York Times magazine, headlined "The Cashless Bank That Deals in Millions," reported, "There is only one bank in Basel that does not look like $1 million. It is the super bank. Indeed, it is doubtful if there is anywhere a bank that looks less like a bank than does the Bank for International Settlements. There is no Bank for International Settlements stretching in big solid letters across its facade. There is no ostentatiously small bronze plaque at the door. There is nothing at all to reveal its identity to the passer-by." Nor did the building sound like a bank. There were no counters where banknotes rustled, no adding machines, nor even the sound of a pen scratching on a ledger. The monies did not physically move through the BIS. When Germany made a reparations payment, it informed the BIS that the Reichsbank had credited the BIS's account in Berlin. The BIS then informed the national banks of those countries receiving reparations, such as, for example, Britain, that the monies were available to draw on if they so wished. If they did not, in case the movement of substantial sums might affect exchange rates, the funds remained in the BIS's account. In the meantime, the BIS used the funds earmarked for Britain to buy securities, which it could sell if and when Britain wanted to draw its monies. That was the theory. The practice, at least at first, was not quite so smooth. In February 1931, Gates Magara, the bank's American president, wrote to H.C.F. Finlayson in Athens, asking about the Bank of Greece's gold. Finlayson, a former British financial attaché in Berlin, was now an advisor to the Bank of Greece. Some of the Greek bank's gold may have gone missing. Rather like nowadays, it seemed the accounting at the Bank of Greece left something to be desired. "What has ever happened to the gold of the Bank of Greece, some of which you thought might be left in our custody in Paris or elsewhere?" inquired Magara, who, as the president of the BIS, might have been expected to know what it held and where. It might, Magara suggested, be a good time to find the Greek gold and place it with the BIS. The BIS, wrote Magara, could give the Bank of Greece all sorts of facilities rather greater than those of a local central bank. For example, if the Bank of Greece held gold at the Bank of France and wanted to buy another currency, it first had to buy francs from the Bank of France. The Bank of Greece then converted the francs to the second currency with all the usual losses of exchange rates and commissions. However, if the Bank of Greece held gold at the Bank of France in the name of the BIS could give the Bank of Greece any currency it desires at any time and can fix an agreed rate without going through the actual exchange operation. And the BIS did not charge any commission. 13,000 people applied for jobs at the BIS, and by the end of 1930, 95 people worked there. However, few were bankers. Many were lawyers or economists who had previously been employed at international organizations such as the League of Nations or the Dawes Plan Agent General's office. Salaries were comparatively high. The president received $36,000 plus $14,000 entertainment allowance. Heads of department were paid between $15,000 and $20,000 a year, all tax-free. The average American salary in 1930 was about $2,000 a year. The management reflected the balance of nationalities. The general manager, Pierre Quesnay, was French and a former member of the Young Committee. His German deputy, Ernst Hulse, had worked for the Reichsbank. But not everyone was happy. Hjalmar Schacht, who loved to refer to the BIS as my bank, continued to rage over the scale of reparations under the Young Plan. In December 1929, he wrote to J.P. Morgan that he would not take up his directorship at the BIS. The following March, Schacht resigned from the Reichsbank.
The alternative lending industry can provide a very lucrative opportunity for brokers and affiliate partners. Whether you're specialized in commercial lending or real estate financing, having the right funding partner can make the difference between earning thousands on a deal or losing a commission. Go Capital understands this. You work hard to secure your clients and deserve to be compensated. Unfortunately, due to increased competition, many lending companies have stopped working with new agents, are not providing adequate training, are slow to respond, and simply not issuing competitive approvals. By joining Go Capital's partner program, your dedicated support specialist will assist you every step of the way. As a broker, you know that it's not always a matter of obtaining a loan approval. You need competitive terms. Go Capital's catalog of loan products allows you to offer the best financial solutions to your clients. Options include business lines of credit, SBA loans, merchant cash advances, commercial mortgages, hard money fix and flip loans, bridge financing, equipment leasing, invoice factoring, and more. What does this mean for you? More deals, more commission, and satisfied customers. As a registered partner, you'll receive free access to the Broker Affiliate Sales Portal. This system allows you to easily manage your deals and also offers tools, training, and resources that will help you succeed. Frustrated with never being able to speak with someone about your deals? At Go Capital, someone is always available, whether you prefer to call, email, chat, or even visit our office headquarters in downtown Miami, we are always available to answer your questions. While other companies may advertise the highest commissions, they often fall short when it comes to issuing competitive terms, making the process easy, or simply being responsive. Go Capital provides quality broker support and training, and quickly identifies how to best structure a transaction. With our multitude of loan programs, comprehensive training systems, and quality service, you can focus on more important things, generating more business. Need us to join a conference call with a client? Need help presenting an offer? No problem. Our loan specialists are here to help. For more information or to sign up, visit our partner page on www.gocapital.com today or call 1-866-257-2973 and speak with an account manager. Go Capital, where your success is our business.